Good evening all and welcome back to Untold Fears. Tonight, the asphalt arteries of America become highways to hell as we journey alongside 7 truckers who encountered pure terror on the open road. These are not tales of mechanical breakdowns or traffic accidents, but stories of encounters that defy explanation and shatter sanity. From phantom voices crackling through CB radios in the dead of night to cargo that should never have been loaded, from rest stops that exist outside of time itself, to highways where the laws of reality bend and break like twisted metal. Each mile marker becomes a monument to fear, each truck stop a potential gateway to nightmare. Tonight, we ride shotgun with drivers who discovered that the most dangerous thing on America's highways is not other vehicles, but something far more sinister, lurking in the spaces between destinations. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe to Untold Fears for daily true horror content that will keep you up at night. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when the darkness calls. Now, let us step into the shadows of the endless highways where civilization ends and terror begins. My name is Talon, and what I am about to tell you happened during my first solo cross-country run in November of 2019. I had been driving local routes for about 8 months, learning the ropes under the supervision of veteran drivers, but this was my first time taking a load from coast to coast by myself. The company had finally decided I was ready for the big leagues, and I was determined to prove them right. My route took me from Portland, Oregon to Jacksonville, Florida, hauling a load of timber products through some of the most desolate stretches of highway in America. I was 24 years old, eager to prove myself, and completely unprepared for what was waiting for me in the darkness of rural Wyoming. The run started normally enough. I picked up my load in Portland during the early morning hours, performed my pre-trip inspection with the kind of obsessive attention to detail that only comes from being new to the job, and hit the road just as the sun was coming up over the Columbia River. My rig was a 2015 Kenworth T680, not the newest truck in the fleet, but well-maintained and reliable. The trailer was loaded with processed lumber, properly secured, and distributed to keep the weight balanced. Everything was by the book, everything was professional, and I felt confident that this run would establish my reputation as a dependable driver. The first day took me through Oregon and into Idaho without incident. I maintained my logbook carefully, took my required breaks at designated intervals, and made good time despite having to adjust to the different handling characteristics of a fully loaded trailer. The weather was clear, traffic was manageable, and my truck was running smoothly. I spent the night at a truck stop in Boise, caught up on some sleep, and prepared for the long haul across Wyoming that would dominate my second day on the road. Wyoming in November is not a forgiving place. The landscape stretches endlessly in all directions, broken only by distant mountain ranges and the occasional cluster of buildings that might generously be called a town. The highway cuts straight through this emptiness like a black ribbon, and for hours at a time you might not see another vehicle. It is the kind of isolation that can get inside your head if you let it, especially when you are used to the constant activity of local routes where you encounter other drivers and customers throughout the day. Out here, it was just me, my truck, and thousands of square miles of nothing. I had been driving for about 6 hours when I decided to switch on my CB radio. I had not used it much during my local driving days, but veteran drivers had told me it was essential for long-haul work. Information about road conditions, weather warnings, speed traps, and general conversation to help pass the miles. I tuned to channel 19, the standard highway frequency, expecting to hear the usual chatter about traffic and truck stops. Instead, what came through my speakers made me question whether I was losing my mind. The voice was clear and strong, cutting through the static with the kind of authority that comes from years of experience. But what the voice was saying made no sense at all. It was giving a detailed traffic report for a section of Wyoming highway that I had not reached yet, describing road conditions and hazards with precise mile markers and specific landmarks. The voice mentioned construction zones that were not on any of my route maps, detours around accidents that had not happened, and warnings about weather conditions that contradicted the clear skies I could see stretching to the horizon. I tried to respond, keying my microphone and asking for clarification about the road conditions ahead. But as soon as I transmitted, the voice stopped completely, leaving nothing but empty static on channel 19. I waited for several minutes, hoping the transmission would resume, but heard nothing. I switched to other channels, scanning through the CB frequencies to see if I could pick up the signal elsewhere, but found only the usual mix of truckers discussing fuel prices and restaurant recommendations. Whatever I had heard seemed to have vanished as suddenly as it had appeared. I decided to dismiss the incident as some kind of atmospheric interference or distant signal that had somehow reached my radio. CB transmissions can travel much farther under certain conditions, bouncing off the ionosphere and picking up conversations from hundreds of miles away. Maybe I had intercepted a traffic report from a completely different state, which would explain why the information did not match my current location. It was a rational explanation, and I held onto it as I continued east across the Wyoming wasteland. But about an hour later, the voice returned. This time it was even clearer, and the information it provided was much more specific. The voice identified itself as Unit Number 127, driving a blue Peterbilt eastbound on Interstate 80, and began describing road hazards that were supposedly just ahead of my position. It warned about black ice on a bridge that I had not yet reached, mentioned a stalled vehicle on the shoulder near a mile marker that was still 20 miles in my future, and advised taking an alternate route around a multi-vehicle accident that would completely shut down the highway for several hours. What made this transmission truly unsettling was how the voice seemed to be speaking directly to me. It mentioned my truck number, correctly identified my load as timber products, and even described the weather conditions I was currently experiencing. But when I tried to respond, asking how the other driver knew these details about my run, the transmission cut off immediately. I was left alone with my thoughts and the growing certainty that something very strange was happening on this desolate stretch of highway. I reached the bridge that the voice had warned me about, and despite the clear, evening air, I slowed down and tested my brakes gently. The bridge surface appeared dry and normal, showing no signs of the black ice that had been mentioned in the transmission. But something made me maintain a cautious speed, some instinct that had been triggered by the phantom warning. As I crossed the span, my headlights illuminated fresh skid marks on the pavement ahead, dark rubber streaks that suggested a vehicle had lost control and gone into a slide at this exact location. The skid marks were still visible when I reached the mile marker, where the voice had warned about a stalled vehicle. Sure enough, there on the shoulder was a pickup truck with its hazard lights flashing, hood up, and a figure standing beside it looking frustrated and cold. I pulled over and offered assistance, and the driver told me he had been stranded for over an hour with engine trouble. He seemed genuinely surprised when I mentioned that I had received a CB warning about his location, saying he did not have a radio and had not contacted anyone for help. As far as he knew, I was the first person to stop. The pattern continued for the next several hours. The phantom voice would provide specific warnings about road conditions, traffic hazards, and weather changes that lay ahead on my route. Each warning proved accurate, from construction zones that appeared exactly where predicted to sudden fog banks that rolled across the highway at the precise locations mentioned in the transmissions. But whenever I tried to communicate with the other driver, whenever I attempted to ask questions or request clarification, the voice would immediately fall silent. By midnight, I was genuinely frightened. The voice had become my constant companion across the Wyoming darkness, providing information that was saving me time and potentially preventing accidents, but I had no idea who was transmitting or how they could possibly know so much about conditions ahead of my position. The rational part of my mind kept insisting there had to be a logical explanation, but but the growing fear in my gut was telling me that I was dealing with something that defied logic entirely. The most disturbing transmission came around 2 in the morning, when I was fighting fatigue and seriously considering stopping for a rest break. The voice returned with its usual clarity, but this time the message was different. Instead of describing road conditions, it began talking about me personally. It knew my name, mentioned details about my driving record and employment history, and described my truck and cargo with perfect accuracy. But then, it said something that made my blood run cold. It warned me not to stop at the rest area that was coming up in 5 miles, because something terrible was waiting there. I had been planning to use that exact rest area for my mandatory break time. It was marked on my maps as a safe parking location with facilities and security lighting, but the voice insisted that I should continue driving, pushing past my legal limits to reach the truck stop in Laramie instead. The transmission described graphic details about what would happen if I stopped at the rest area, mentioning specific threats that seemed to come from intimate knowledge of criminal activity in the area. It was as if the voice belonged to someone who had witnessed terrible things at that location and was desperately trying to prevent me from becoming another victim. Against my better judgment and in violation of my logbook requirements, I followed the phantom advice and drove past the rest area without stopping. As my headlights swept across the facility, I could see that it appeared normal and safe, with good lighting and clear sightlines. But something about the place felt wrong. Some indefinable sense of menace that made me grateful to keep driving. I pushed on to Laramie, arriving at the truck stop just as my legal driving time expired, and settled in for a well-deserved rest period. The next morning, I heard a news report on the truck stop radio about a violent robbery that had occurred at the rest area I had bypassed. 3 armed men had attacked a lone truck driver who had stopped there around the same time I would have arrived. The driver had been severely beaten and hospitalized. His truck had been ransacked, and his cargo had been stolen. If I had followed my original plan and stopped at that rest area, I would have walked directly into the same trap that had nearly killed another driver. I tried to rationalize the coincidence, telling myself that the phantom voice had simply been a strange atmospheric phenomenon that happened to coincide with accurate guesses about road conditions. But deep down, I knew that explanation was inadequate. The voice had saved my life, providing specific warnings that had prevented me from becoming a victim of violence. Someone or something had been watching over me during that long night across Wyoming, guiding me away from danger with knowledge that no living person should have possessed. The transmission stopped completely once I crossed into Colorado the next morning. I spent the rest of my run listening to normal CB chatter from other drivers, discussing mundane topics like fuel prices and restaurant recommendations. The phantom voice never returned, leaving me to wonder whether I had imagined the entire experience or encountered something that existed beyond the boundaries of normal reality. When I returned to my home terminal and filed my trip report, I mentioned the unusual CB transmissions to my dispatcher. He listened with the kind of patient expression that supervisors use when they think their drivers have been on the road too long, then suggested I might want to consider getting more rest between runs. But later that day, one of the veteran drivers pulled me aside and asked about my Wyoming experience. When I described the phantom voice and its accurate warnings, his face went pale. He told about a driver named Charlie Morrison who had worked for our company back in the 1990s. Charlie had been known for his incredible knowledge of road conditions and his ability to warn other drivers about hazards before they encountered them. He drove unit number 127, a blue Peterbilt, and was famous for his detailed traffic reports on Channel 19. Charlie had been killed in a truck accident on that same stretch of Wyoming highway in 1998, dying when he swerved to avoid hitting a stranded motorist and lost control on an icy bridge. The veteran driver showed me a memorial plaque in the company break room, dedicated to Charlie Morrison and his years of service. The photograph showed a middle-aged man with a kind of weathered face that comes from decades of highway driving, and underneath his name was his unit number, 112. According to the memorial, Charlie had been posthumously credited with saving the lives of dozens of drivers through his radio warnings and traffic reports, even after his death, when other drivers claimed to hear his voice providing guidance during dangerous conditions. I never told anyone else about the connection between the phantom voice and Charlie Morrison. Most people would have dismissed it as coincidence or imagination, and I was not interested in being labeled as the rookie driver who believed in ghost stories. But I know what I heard during that long night across Wyoming, and I know that someone was watching over me when I needed help the most. Whether it was atmospheric interference, coincidence, or something more supernatural, I will always be grateful for the phantom voice that guided me safely through the darkness. I have made that Wyoming run dozens of times since then, but I have never again heard the mysterious transmissions on Channel 19. The highway stretches across the same empty landscape. The CB radio picks up the same routine chatter from other drivers, and the night passes without incident. But sometimes, when the conditions are just right and the isolation feels complete, I find myself hoping to hear that familiar voice again, offering guidance and protection to another young driver who might need help navigating the dangers that lurk in the shadows of America's highways. My name is Jaslyn, and my husband Kendricks and I have been team driving across America for 8 years. We met at trucking school back in 2016, got married 2 years later, and have been partners on the road ever since. Team driving is not for everyone, spending 24 hours a day with your spouse in a space barely larger than a walk-in closet, but we make it work. One drives while the other sleeps, keeping the truck moving around the clock and maximizing our earning potential. We have developed a rhythm over the years, a system that allows us to cover more miles and see more of the country than most solo drivers ever will. The incident I am about to describe happened in late September of 2022 during a run from Denver to Seattle, hauling manufactured goods. We had been making good time across Colorado and into Utah, taking turns behind the wheel as planned. Kendricks had been driving through the afternoon while I caught up on sleep in the bunk, and we were scheduled to switch positions around midnight somewhere in central Utah. The route took us through some of the most desolate country in America. Long stretches of desert highway where you might not see another vehicle for an hour at a time. Around 11:30 that night, I woke up to find Kendricks tapping the fuel gauge and frowning at the numbers on our dashboard display. We were running lower than expected, probably due to headwinds and the constant climbing through mountain passes. Our truck gets decent mileage for a heavy-duty rig, but the fuel tank has its limits, and we were still at least 2 hours from our planned fuel stop in Salt Lake City. The gauge was showing less than a quarter tank, which would normally be enough to reach our destination, but Kendricks was not comfortable cutting it that close, with no services between our current position and the city. We started scanning the horizon for truck stops or fuel stations, but this part of Utah is notorious for having long gaps between services. The GPS showed nothing within 50 miles of our position, and the CB radio was picking up only static from other drivers discussing fuel prices and road conditions hundreds of miles away. We were essentially alone in the middle of nowhere, with a fuel situation that was becoming more critical with every mile we traveled. Kendricks suggested we start looking for any kind of fuel, even a small gas station that might accommodate a commercial vehicle, rather than risk running out of diesel in the desert. That was when we saw the lights in the distance, a warm glow on the northern horizon that suggested civilization ahead. As we crested a low ridge, a truck stop came into view, sitting beside the highway like an oasis in the desert. It was not marked on our GPS or mentioned in any of our route guides, but it was definitely real and definitely open for business. The sign out front read, Desert Rose Truck Plaza, in faded red letters, and beneath it was another sign advertising fuel, food, and shower facilities. It looked like exactly what we needed, a full-service truck stop in the middle of nowhere. The facility appeared to be stuck in time, with architecture and signage that looked like it had not been updated since the 1980s. The fuel islands were the old-fashioned type, with mechanical price displays showing diesel prices that seemed impossibly low for current market rates. The main building had the classic truck stop design with large windows and a neon sign that flickered intermittently in the desert night. Several other big rigs were parked in the lot, their running lights creating a constellation of red and amber dots against the dark landscape. We pulled up to the fuel island closest to the building, and Kendricks climbed out to start the fueling process while I gathered our logbooks and prepared to update our records. The fuel pump was an older model that required him to lift a heavy handle and wait for the system to activate, but it seemed to be working normally. The diesel flowed at the expected rate, and the mechanical price display clicked upward at intervals that suggested everything was functioning properly. The only unusual thing was the price, which was almost $2 per gallon lower than what we had been paying at major truck stops. While the tank filled, I walked into the main building to pay for the fuel and perhaps grab some snacks for the road. The interior was even more dated than the exterior, with wood-paneled walls, orange carpet that had seen better decades, and a lunch counter with red vinyl stools. The merchandise was arranged on metal shelving units that looked like they had been installed during the Carter administration, and the products themselves seemed to be from an earlier era. The candy bars had packaging designs I had not seen since childhood. The magazines on the rack were several months old, and the prices on everything were significantly lower than current market rates. The clerk behind the counter was a middle-aged woman with gray hair and a uniform that matched the retro aesthetic of the entire facility. She smiled pleasantly as I approached, but something about her seemed slightly off, as if she was performing a role rather than genuinely interacting with customers. When I mentioned that we had not seen this truck stop on any of our maps or GPS systems, she just shrugged and said that a lot of drivers missed it because it was not part of any major chain. She processed our fuel purchase using an old mechanical cash register that required her to punch in each number manually. I decided to use the restroom before we got back on the road, and that was when things started to feel genuinely strange. The facilities were clean but dated, with fixtures and tile work that looked like they had been installed decades ago and never updated. The mirror above the sink had developed a slight haze around the edges, and the fluorescent lighting had the flickering quality of old ballast that needed replacement. But what really caught my attention was the radio playing softly in the background, broadcasting what sounded like a news program from the 1980s, complete with references to political figures and events from that era. When I returned to the truck, Kendricks was finishing up the fueling process and looked puzzled by the total cost displayed on the pump. The amount was much lower than what we normally paid for a full tank, even accounting for the advertised price per gallon. He had tried to pay with our company fuel card, but the old system could not process electronic payments, so we had to go inside and pay cash. The clerk seemed unsurprised by this arrangement and accepted our money without comment, providing a handwritten receipt that looked like something from a small-town gas station in 1985. As we prepared to leave, I noticed that several other drivers were sitting in the restaurant area of the truck stop, eating meals and drinking coffee like any normal evening. But something about the scene felt wrong, like a movie set designed to look natural but slightly off in ways that were hard to identify. The conversations I could overhear seemed to focus on topics from decades past, with references to trucking regulations and industry changes that had been resolved years ago. The drivers themselves looked normal enough, but there was something about their clothing and mannerisms that suggested they belonged to an earlier era. We climbed back into our truck and prepared to continue our journey to Seattle, grateful to have avoided a potential fuel emergency in the middle of the Utah desert. But as we pulled away from the Desert Rose Truck Plaza, I looked back to wave goodbye to the clerk who had helped us, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The building was dark, the fuel islands were unlit, and the parking lot was empty except for the shadows of vehicles that might or might not have been there. The warm glow that had attracted us from miles away had vanished completely, leaving nothing but darkness where the truck stop had been. Kendrick saw my expression in the rearview mirror and asked what was wrong. I told him to look back at the truck stop, but when he checked his mirrors, there was nothing there except empty desert and the faint outline of mountains against the starlit sky. We pulled over and both climbed out of the cab to look back down the highway, but the Desert Rose Truck Plaza had completely disappeared. There were no lights, no buildings, no signs that any kind of facility had ever existed at that location. Just darkness and the endless expanse of Utah wilderness. We stood beside our truck for several minutes, trying to make sense of what we had experienced. Our fuel gauge showed a full tank. Our receipt from the transaction was still in my pocket, and our logbook recorded the stop exactly as it had happened. But the physical evidence of the truck stop itself had vanished as completely as if it had never existed. We climbed back into the cab and continued toward Salt Lake City, both of us shaken by the impossibility of what we had witnessed, but unable to deny the reality of our full fuel tank. The next day, when we reached our destination in Seattle, I called the Utah Department of Transportation to ask about truck stops along the route we had traveled. The dispatcher I spoke with was familiar with that section of highway and confirmed that there were no commercial fuel facilities between the points where we had started looking and Salt Lake City. When I described the Desert Rose Truck Plaza and provided the approximate location, she checked her records and found no permits, licenses, or business registrations for any truck stop at that location or anywhere near it. I also called several trucking companies that run regular routes through Utah, asking their dispatchers if they knew about a truck stop called Desert Rose. None of them had heard of it, and several mentioned the drivers sometimes report seeing facilities that do not exist when they are tired or dealing with fuel stress, but our experience had been too detailed, too interactive, and too beneficial to dismiss as hallucination or wishful thinking. We had refueled our truck, purchased items, and interacted with other people in a facility that apparently did not exist. Over the following weeks, I researched the history of that section of Utah highway, looking for any reference to a truck stop or commercial facility that might once have existed at the location where we had our experience. What I found was disturbing and fascinating in equal measure. In 1987, a truck stop called Desert Rose had indeed operated at that exact location, serving travelers along the highway for about 3 years. But the facility had been destroyed in a fire that killed the owner and several customers who were trapped inside when the building collapsed. The fire had started in the kitchen area during the early morning hours when the truck stop was busy, with drivers stopping for breakfast and fuel. Faulty electrical wiring had ignited cooking oil, and the flames spread faster than anyone expected. The exits became blocked by debris, and 7 people died in the blaze, including the owner, 2 employees, and 4 truck drivers who had stopped for the night. The facility was never rebuilt, and the location had remained empty desert ever since, marked only by concrete foundations that were eventually covered by blowing sand. According to the newspaper archives from the time, the Desert Rose Truck Plaza had been a popular stop for long-haul drivers, known for good food, reasonable prices, and friendly service. The owner had been a former trucker himself, who understood what drivers needed during long cross-country runs. The facility had been designed with an old-fashioned aesthetic, even when it was new, emphasizing comfort and hospitality over modern efficiency. But after the fire, the insurance settlement was tied up in legal disputes, and the property was never redeveloped. I shared this information with Kendricks, and we both realized that our experience had been far stranger than we initially understood. We had apparently stopped at a truck stop that had been destroyed 35 years earlier, interacted with people who had died in that fire, and received fuel and services from a facility that existed only in some kind of supernatural echo of its former self. The question was whether we had somehow traveled back in time, encountered genuine ghosts, or experienced something else entirely that defied conventional explanation. We have driven that same route several times since our encounter with the Desert Rose Truck Plaza, always watching for any sign of the facility that had appeared so providentially when we needed fuel. But we have never seen it again, and that stretch of Utah highway remains as empty and desolate as it was before our mysterious stop. Sometimes, late at night, when we are driving through similar desert landscapes, we find ourselves scanning the horizon for lights that might indicate another impossible truck stop, another chance encounter with the supernatural infrastructure of America's highways. The experience changed how we think about our profession and the places we travel. The highways are not just ribbons of asphalt connecting cities and towns, but pathways through layers of history and memory, where the past sometimes bleeds through into the present. Truck stops are not just commercial facilities providing fuel and food, but gathering places for a community of drivers whose stories and experiences create their own kind of reality that may persist long after the physical structures disappear. We keep the receipt from the Desert Rose Truck Plaza in our logbook as a reminder that the world contains mysteries that cannot be explained by conventional logic or dismissed as imagination. Whether we encountered genuine supernatural phenomena, traveled through some kind of temporal anomaly, or experienced something else entirely, we know that we refueled our truck at a place that should not have existed and received help from people who should not have been there. Sometimes the road provides exactly what you need, even if that provision comes from beyond the boundaries of normal reality. My name is Dalen, and I have been driving the interstates of America for 23 years. In that time, I have seen more of this country than most people see in a lifetime, from the forests of Maine to the deserts of Nevada, from the Great Plains of Kansas to the mountains of Colorado. I have hauled everything from produce to machinery, from chemicals to livestock, and I have learned to read the road like other people read books. Every stretch of highway has its own personality, its own dangers, and its own stories. But nothing in my 2 decades of experience prepared me for what I encountered during a 3-week period in the fall of 2020, when a section of Interstate 40 through New Mexico became a hunting ground for something that defied every assumption I had about human nature. It started with abandoned vehicles, not the usual kind of roadside breakdowns that you see every day, with drivers waiting for tow trucks or mechanics, but cars and trucks that had been left empty beside the highway with no obvious explanation for why they were there. The first one I noticed was a blue Honda Civic sitting on the shoulder about 50 miles east of Albuquerque, doors standing open, hazard lights still blinking. I slowed down to see if the driver needed assistance, but there was no one around. The car looked like someone had simply stopped, gotten out, and walked away into the desert, leaving behind personal belongings scattered across the seats and floor. I called it in on my CB radio, thinking maybe another driver had already stopped to help and given the stranded motorist a ride to the nearest service station. But the responses I got back were strange. Other truckers reported seeing similar abandoned vehicles along the same stretch of highway, all with the same characteristics. Doors open, engines sometimes still running, personal items left behind, but no sign of the drivers or passengers. Some of the cars had been there for days, based on the layer of dust that had accumulated on the surfaces, but no one seemed to know what had happened to the people who had been driving them. Over the next few days, I started paying closer attention to that section of Interstate 40, making mental notes of every abandoned vehicle I encountered. The pattern was consistent and disturbing. Cars and trucks left on the shoulder or pulled slightly off the highway, always with signs that the occupants had exited quickly but not necessarily under duress. No broken glass, no damage from accidents, no obvious mechanical problems that would require someone to abandon their vehicle. Just empty cars sitting in the New Mexico sun, slowly accumulating sand and dust while their owners remained missing. I began talking to other drivers about what I was seeing, and the conversations were troubling. It was not just me noticing these abandoned vehicles. Long-haul truckers who ran regular routes through that area were reporting the same phenomenon, and some of them had been seeing it for weeks before I started paying attention. Even more disturbing were the reports of drivers who had seen the vehicles when they were not yet abandoned. Ordinary cars and trucks traveling normally along the highway, only to find the same vehicles empty and deserted when they passed through the area again days later. The CB chatters started to focus on this mystery, with drivers sharing information about specific vehicles they had seen, and when they had last observed them occupied versus abandoned. A red pickup truck that had been traveling eastbound on Tuesday was found empty on the shoulder on Thursday. A white sedan with Florida plates that several drivers had seen during daylight hours was discovered abandoned after midnight the same day. A family SUV with luggage racks and out-of-state plates that had been keeping pace with traffic in the afternoon was sitting empty beside the highway the following morning. But the truly frightening part was not just the abandoned vehicles themselves, but what other drivers started reporting about their own experiences along that stretch of highway. Close calls with aggressive drivers who seemed to be deliberately trying to force other vehicles off the road. Semi-trucks that would suddenly change lanes without signaling, attempting to ram cars and smaller trucks into the guardrails or median strips. CB radio transmissions that seemed designed to lure drivers into stopping at specific locations where they could be isolated and vulnerable. I started keeping a detailed log of everything I observed along that section of Interstate 40, noting the locations and descriptions of abandoned vehicles, recording unusual radio transmissions, and documenting my own interactions with suspicious drivers. The pattern that emerged was chilling. There was definitely someone using that highway as a hunting ground, systematically targeting lone drivers and somehow forcing them to abandon their vehicles. Whether the missing people were being kidnapped, murdered, or something else entirely, it was clear that a predator was operating along one of America's major transportation corridors. The first time I became a target myself was during an eastbound run in early October. I was hauling electronics from Los Angeles to Atlanta, making good time through Arizona and into New Mexico. It was late afternoon when I noticed a black semi-truck that seemed to be maintaining a consistent distance behind me, always staying about a quarter-mile back, regardless of how I adjusted my speed. At first, I thought it might just be another driver with a similar schedule, but when I slowed down to let him pass, he slowed down too. When I sped up, he matched my acceleration exactly. I tried raising him on the CB radio, asking if he needed to get around me or if there was some problem with my rig that he was trying to warn me about. No response. I switched to different channels, tried various call signs and trucker handles, but got nothing back except silence. The black truck just continued following at the same distance, like a shadow on the highway. After about an hour of this, I decided to test whether he was deliberately following me by taking an exit for fuel and food. If he was just traveling the same route, he would continue on the interstate. If he was targeting me specifically, he would follow me off the highway. I pulled into a large truck stop with multiple fuel islands and plenty of parking, hoping that the presence of other drivers and commercial activity would discourage whatever this guy was planning. But instead of pulling up to fuel or park with the other trucks, the black semi drove slowly through the lot, as if the driver was looking for something specific. I watched from my cab as he circled the entire facility, then pulled out to the edge of the parking area and just sat there, engine idling, waiting. I decided to stay at that truck stop longer than I had originally planned, hoping the other driver would get bored and move on to whatever his actual destination was. I bought fuel, grabbed a meal in the restaurant, took a shower, and generally killed as much time as I could while keeping an eye on the black truck. But he never moved from his position at the edge of the lot. He just sat there, waiting, watching, like a predator that had identified its prey and was prepared to be patient until the right moment presented itself. When I finally decided I could not delay my departure any longer, I made sure to leave during daylight hours when there would be plenty of traffic on the interstate. I pulled out of the truck stop and merged back onto I-40, hoping that the black truck would reveal itself to be a coincidence by staying at the facility or heading in a different direction. But within minutes, I saw him in my mirrors, once again maintaining that same precise distance behind me, matching my speed exactly and making no attempt to pass or communicate. This continued for over 200 miles, through the afternoon and into the evening. The black truck stayed behind me like a malevolent shadow, never getting closer, never falling back, never trying to make contact or explain his behavior. As the sun started to set and traffic began to thin out, I became genuinely frightened. Whatever this driver wanted, he was clearly prepared to follow me indefinitely until he found the right opportunity to make his move. I started looking for places where I could stop safely, preferably locations with good lighting and other people around. That was when I noticed that we were approaching the section of highway where I had been seeing all those abandoned vehicles. The realization hit me like a physical blow. This was not a coincidence. The black truck was not just following me randomly. He was herding me toward a specific area where he had operated before, where he had successfully targeted other drivers and somehow forced them to abandon their vehicles. I was being led into a trap that had been sprung on dozens of other people, and I had walked right into it by following a predictable route at a predictable time. I grabbed my CB microphone and started broadcasting on multiple channels, describing my location, the black truck that was following me, and my suspicion that I was being targeted by whoever was responsible for all the abandoned vehicles in this area. I asked any drivers who could hear me to call law enforcement and report what was happening. I also asked if anyone else was traveling eastbound on I-40 and could provide backup or assistance. The responses I got back were immediate and alarming. Other drivers confirmed that they had seen the black truck following various vehicles over the past several weeks, always using the same tactics, always in the same general area. But more disturbing were the reports from drivers who had tried to intervene in similar situations and found themselves being targeted as well. The black truck was not operating alone. There were at least 2 other vehicles involved in whatever scheme was being run along the stretch of highway, and they were coordinated enough to handle multiple targets simultaneously. Drivers who had tried to help other motorists in distress had found themselves being forced off the road by vehicles that appeared out of nowhere, working together with military precision to isolate and control their victims. As darkness fell and traffic became even lighter, the black truck finally made its move. Instead of maintaining his usual following distance, he began closing the gap between us, accelerating until he was right behind my trailer, close enough that I could see his headlights filling my mirrors. Then he started playing games with me, alternately backing off and then rushing up to within inches of my rear bumper, using his superior mass and power to intimidate me and force me to react in ways that would give him an advantage. I tried to outrun him, pushing my truck to speeds that were dangerous for the load I was carrying and the road conditions. But the black truck had more power than my rig, and he stayed with me easily, sometimes pulling alongside in the left lane and attempting to force me onto the shoulder. I could see the driver now, a large man wearing what looked like a baseball cap, but his face was hidden in shadow, and I could not make out any specific features. What I could see was that he was driving with the kind of calm precision that suggested this was not his first time forcing another vehicle off the highway. The cat-and-mouse game continued for about 20 miles, with the black truck alternately trying to ram me from behind, force me off the road from the side, and block my path by pulling in front of me and slowing down. I managed to avoid his attacks by using my knowledge of truck handling and my familiarity with the highway. But I knew it was only a matter of time before he succeeded in stopping me or forcing me to crash. I needed help, and I needed it fast, before we reached whatever location he had chosen for the final phase of his attack. That was when I saw the lights in my rearview mirror. Not just one set of headlights, but several, approaching fast from behind us. The cavalry was arriving in the form of other truckers who had heard my CB transmissions and decided to intervene. I had never been so happy to see a convoy of big rigs bearing down on my position, their drivers coordinating on the radio to surround the black truck and prevent him from continuing his attack. The response from the trucking community was immediate and overwhelming, with drivers converging from both directions to help a fellow trucker in distress. The black truck realized what was happening and immediately broke off his attack, accelerating past me and disappearing into the darkness ahead. But the other truckers did not let him escape easily. They maintained radio contact with each other, tracking his position and reporting his movements to law enforcement agencies along his route. Within an hour, state police had set up roadblocks and were actively searching for the black semi that matched the description provided by multiple witnesses. The driver was arrested before midnight at a way station in Texas, where he was found to be carrying false identification, stolen license plates, and a trailer that had been modified to transport people against their will. The interior of his trailer had been converted into a mobile prison with restraints, soundproofing, and other equipment that left no doubt about his intentions. Even more disturbing was a collection of personal items he had taken from his victims, souvenirs from the people whose vehicles had been found abandoned along Interstate 40. The investigation that followed revealed that the driver, whose real name was Marcus Webb, had been operating along that stretch of highway for over 6 months, systematically targeting lone drivers and using various techniques to force them off the road. Some victims were kidnapped and transported to isolated locations where they were murdered. Others were killed immediately and their bodies disposed of in the desert. But all of them had their vehicles left abandoned as a kind of calling card that marked the killer's territory. Webb had been working with 2 accomplices who operated in a coordinated pattern, using CB radios to communicate and share information about potential targets. They had developed sophisticated techniques for isolating victims, including fake emergency calls, staged breakdowns, and aggressive driving tactics designed to force people into stopping at specific locations where they could be overpowered. The abandoned vehicles I had been seeing were just the visible evidence of a much larger operation that had been claiming lives for months. The final count was 23 victims over a 6-month period, making this one of the most prolific highway killing sprees in American history. The victims included truck drivers, families on vacation, business travelers, and college students, all of whom had the misfortune to be traveling alone or in small groups through that particular section of New Mexico. Their vehicles had been left as monuments to the killer's work, gradually accumulating along the highway until the pattern became obvious to observant drivers like me. The experience changed how I approach my work and my travels. I am much more aware of vehicles that seem to be following me, much more careful about where and when I stop for fuel or rest, and much more willing to trust my instincts when something feels wrong about a situation. The highways that once felt like open roads to freedom now feel like potential hunting grounds where predators can operate with relative impunity, using our isolation and predictable routines against us. But the experience also demonstrated the power of the trucking community to protect its own members. When I called for help on that dark night in New Mexico, drivers from hundreds of miles away responded without hesitation, putting themselves at risk to help a fellow trucker they had never met. That solidarity, that willingness to come to each other's aid, is what makes it possible for us to continue doing this job despite the dangers we face from both mechanical failures and human predators. I still run routes through New Mexico, but now I travel with a much greater awareness of my surroundings and a much deeper appreciation for the network of drivers who share these highways with me. The abandoned vehicles are gone now, cleared away by law enforcement as evidence in the prosecution of Marcus Webb and his accomplices. but the memory of what they represented and the knowledge of how close I came to becoming another victim stays with me every time I drive through that stretch of desert highway where evil once walked freely among us. The Interstate 40 corridor through New Mexico looks peaceful now. Just another stretch of highway connecting cities and towns across the American Southwest. But those of us who lived through the reign of the highway butcher know that appearances can be deceiving, and that sometimes the greatest danger on the road comes not from mechanical failure or weather conditions, but from the human monsters who see our isolation as opportunity and our trust as weakness. The road is only as safe as we make it for each other, and vigilance is the price we pay for the freedom to keep moving across this vast and sometimes dangerous country. My name is Jalen, and I have been driving nights for Consolidated Freight for 7 years. Most people think night driving is harder, more dangerous, but I actually prefer it. Less traffic, cooler temperatures, and a kind of peaceful solitude that you never get during the day. The highways become different places after midnight, quieter and more mysterious, where you can make good time and really feel like you own the road. But there are also things that happen at night, things that you do not see during daylight hours, things that make you question everything you thought you knew about the world. What I am about to tell you happened during a regular run from Houston to Denver in March of 2021. I was hauling automotive parts, a routine load that I had carried dozens of times before along the same route. The weather was clear, my truck was running smoothly, and I was making excellent time across the empty highways of Texas and Colorado. It should have been a completely unremarkable trip, the kind of routine haul that pays the bills and gets you home on schedule. Instead, it became the most terrifying experience of my driving career, an encounter with something that defied every rational explanation I could construct. The first time I saw the hitchhiker was around 2 in the morning, somewhere between Amarillo and the Colorado border. I was cruising along Interstate 25 at about 70 miles per hour when my headlights illuminated a figure standing beside the highway. It was a woman, probably in her 30s, wearing jeans and a light-colored jacket, with her thumb extended in the classic hitchhiking gesture. She appeared completely normal, just another stranded traveler looking for a ride. But something about the scene felt wrong in ways that I could not immediately identify. For one thing, there was no broken-down vehicle anywhere in sight. No car on the shoulder, no truck pulled off into the grass, nothing to explain why she was standing alone beside the highway in the middle of nowhere at 2 in the morning. For another, she was positioned in a location that made no sense for hitchhiking. She was standing on a straight stretch of road with good visibility, but there were no exits, no towns, no services for at least 50 miles in either direction. Even if someone had picked her up, where could they possibly be taking her? I slowed down slightly as I passed her, more out of curiosity than any intention to stop. Solo female drivers learn early that picking up hitchhikers is asking for trouble, and I had no intention of violating that fundamental safety rule. But as my headlights swept over her, I got a better look at her appearance, and what I saw made my skin crawl. She looked completely normal from a distance, but up close there was something subtly wrong with her proportions, something that made my brain struggle to process what my eyes were seeing. I continued driving, but the image of the woman stayed with me. There had been something about her face, something about the way she moved that did not seem quite human. It was like looking at a very good mannequin, realistic enough to fool you at first glance, but wrong enough to trigger that instinctive unease that tells you something is not right. I told myself I was being paranoid, that night driving was making me see things that were not there, and I tried to focus on the road ahead and forget about the strange encounter. But 20 miles later, there she was again. Same woman, same clothes, same hitchhiking gesture, standing beside the highway, as if she had never moved from her original position. But that was impossible. I had been driving at highway speeds for the past 20 minutes, covering ground that would take hours to walk, and there was no way she could have gotten ahead of me by any normal means. unless she had been picked up by another driver and then dropped off again in this new location, which made no sense given the remote area and the late hour. I slowed down again as I approached her, this time paying much closer attention to details. She was wearing exactly the same clothes, standing in exactly the same posture, with exactly the same expression on her face. It was as if someone had copied and pasted her from one location to another, like a glitch in a video game where the same character appears multiple times. Even more disturbing, she turned her head to watch my truck pass, and in the brief moment when my headlights illuminated her face directly, I could see that her eyes were completely black. Not just dark brown or wearing sunglasses, but solid black orbs that reflected my headlights like pools of oil. I grabbed my CB radio and called out to any other drivers who might be in the area, asking if anyone had seen a female hitchhiker along this stretch of highway. The responses I got back were immediate and unsettling. Several other drivers reported seeing the same woman at different locations along Interstate 25, all within the past hour, all describing her exact appearance and behavior. But the locations they mentioned were impossible. According to their reports, she had appeared to drivers who were hundreds of miles apart simultaneously, which meant either there were multiple women who looked exactly alike, or something very strange was happening along this highway. The third sighting came 30 miles later, and this time she was not standing beside the road. She was standing in the middle of my lane, directly in my path, forcing me to hit my brakes and swerve to avoid hitting her. As I wrestled with the steering wheel and brought my truck under control, I caught a glimpse of her in my side mirror, and what I saw made my blood turn to ice. She was no longer standing where I had swerved around her. Instead, she was somehow keeping pace with my truck, running alongside my trailer at highway speeds with an inhuman gait that covered ground faster than any person should be able to move. I floored the accelerator, pushing my truck well beyond safe speeds for the load I was carrying, but she stayed with me easily. In my mirrors, I could see her running in the darkness beside my rig, her movements smooth and effortless, as if she was floating just above the pavement rather than actually touching it. Even more terrifying, she was gradually getting closer to my cab, closing the distance between us with each stride, as if she intended to reach my driver's side door and climb aboard, whether I wanted her to or not. The chase continued for several miles, with me pushing my truck to its limits while this impossible figure kept pace beside me. I was approaching curves and hills at dangerous speeds, my trailer swaying behind me as I fought to maintain control, but I was too terrified to slow down. Whatever this thing was, it clearly wanted something from me, and I had no intention of finding out what that might be. The rational part of my mind kept insisting that this had to be some kind of hallucination brought on by fatigue or stress, but the evidence of my eyes was undeniable. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the chase ended. I checked my mirrors and saw nothing but empty highway behind me. No sign of the running figure that had been pursuing my truck just moments before. I gradually reduced my speed to something more reasonable and tried to calm my racing heart, telling myself that whatever I had experienced was over and I could continue my run without further incident. But I was wrong. The encounters were not finished with me yet. The fourth sighting was the most disturbing of all. I was approaching the Colorado border, still about an hour away from my scheduled rest stop, when I noticed something in my passenger side mirror that made me question my sanity. The hitchhiker was inside my cab, sitting in the passenger seat staring at me with those black, oil-like eyes. She had somehow gotten into my locked truck without opening any doors, without making any sound, without any indication of how she had managed to breach the sealed environment of my cab. I slammed on my brakes and brought the truck to a stop on the shoulder, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might explode in my chest. I turned to confront whatever was sitting next to me, but the passenger seat was empty. There was no sign that anyone had been there, no depression in the cushion, no warmth from a human body, nothing to suggest that my eyes had not been playing tricks on me. But I knew what I had seen in that mirror, and it was not a hallucination or a trick of the light. I climbed out of my cab and performed the most thorough inspection of my truck that I had ever done, checking every door, every window, every possible entry point to see if someone could have gotten inside. Everything was locked tight, exactly as I had left it when I started my run in Houston. There was no physical evidence that anyone had been in my truck, but the memory of those black eyes staring at me from the passenger seat was burned into my brain like a photograph. I called my dispatcher and reported what I was experiencing, asking if they had received any similar reports from other drivers along this route. The response was not reassuring. Apparently, there had been several incidents over the past few months involving drivers who reported encounters with a female hitchhiker along various highways in Texas and Colorado. Some drivers had attempted to help her and found their trucks breaking down in remote locations. Others had reported mechanical problems, route confusion, and unexplained delays after seeing her. A few drivers had been found dead in their cabs after reporting encounters with the mysterious woman, apparently from heart attacks or other sudden medical emergencies. The dispatcher advised me to complete my run as quickly as possible and avoid stopping except for fuel and mandatory rest periods. He also suggested that I maintain radio contact with other drivers and report any additional sightings immediately. The company was taking these reports seriously enough to warn their drivers and coordinate with law enforcement. But so far, no one had been able to explain what was happening or how to prevent it. I continued toward Colorado, keeping constant watch on my mirrors and maintaining radio contact with every trucker I could reach. The CB chatter was full of discussions about the mysterious hitchhiker, with drivers sharing their own encounters and theories about what she might be. Some thought she was the ghost of someone who had died in a highway accident. Others speculated about supernatural entities that fed on fear or confusion, but no one had any definitive answers. What everyone agreed on was that she was dangerous, and that encountering her seemed to bring bad luck or worse to the drivers who saw her. The fifth and final sighting occurred just as I crossed into Colorado. I was climbing a long grade through the mountains when my engine suddenly started losing power, forcing me to downshift and slow to a crawl. The gauge readings looked normal, but my truck was struggling as if it was pulling twice its actual weight. I managed to reach a truck stop at the top of the pass and pulled in for an emergency inspection, fearing that I was about to experience a major mechanical failure far from any repair facilities. As I climbed out of my cab to check under the hood, I saw her one last time. She was standing about 50 feet away, beside the fuel islands, no longer hitchhiking, but simply watching me with an expression that might have been sadness or regret. In the bright lights of the truck stop, she looked almost normal, just another traveler stopping for fuel or food, but her eyes were still those terrible black voids, and there was something about her posture that suggested she was not quite solid, not quite real. I walked toward her, determined to confront whatever this thing was, and demand answers about what it wanted from me, but with each step I took in her direction, she seemed to become less substantial, fading like mist in the mountain air. By the time I reached the spot where she had been standing, there was nothing there except the concrete pavement and the harsh glare of sodium vapor lights. She had vanished completely, leaving behind no trace of her presence except the memory of those haunting black eyes. My truck started normally when I tried the ignition, running smoothly, as if there had never been any mechanical problems. I completed my run to Denver without further incident, delivered my load on schedule, and filed a detailed report about my encounters with the mysterious hitchhiker. The company forwarded my report to law enforcement and added it to their growing file of similar incidents, but I never heard if they reached any conclusions about what had been happening along that highway corridor. I later learned that the stretch of highway where I had first encountered the hitchhiker was the site of a fatal accident 3 years earlier. A young woman named Sarah Martinez had been driving alone at night when her car broke down in that exact location. She had gotten out to look for help and was struck by a passing truck while walking along the shoulder. The driver never stopped, and Sarah died alone beside the highway her body not discovered until the next morning. According to the police report, she had been wearing jeans and a light-colored jacket, exactly matching the appearance of the figure I had seen. I have driven that route dozens of times since my encounter with the hitchhiker, but I've never seen her again. Other drivers continue to report sightings along various highways throughout Texas and Colorado, and the company continues to collect reports and coordinate with authorities. Some drivers believe she is the restless spirit of Sarah Martinez, still trying to get home 3 years after her death. Others think she represents something more primal and dangerous, a predator that uses our instincts to help stranded travelers against us. What I know for certain is that night driving is different now. I'm much more cautious about who and what I see beside the highway, much more skeptical of encounters that seem too convenient or too coincidental. The roads that once felt like peaceful refugees from the chaos of daily life now feel like hunting grounds where things that should not exist prey on the isolation and vulnerability of long-haul drivers. Every hitchhiker I see, every figure beside the highway, every unexpected passenger in my mirrors reminds me that there are mysteries out there that our rational minds cannot explain or our safety procedures protect against. The interstate highway system connects every corner of America with ribbons of asphalt and concrete, but it also connects us to things that exist in the spaces between the known and the unknown, between the living and the dead, between the safe daylight world and the dangerous realm of night. Sometimes the road gives you exactly what you need to reach your destination safely. Sometimes it gives you exactly what you need to never reach your destination at all. And sometimes, if you are very unlucky, it gives you a passenger who was never really alive to begin with, riding along in your cab and your mirrors, waiting for the right moment to collect whatever debt the highway thinks you owe. My name is Dion, and I have been driving the highways of America for 31 years. Next month, I will be hanging up my keys and retiring to a small house in Florida where my wife is already planning our golden years. After 3 decades on the road, I thought I had seen everything the trucking life could throw at me. Breakdowns in the middle of nowhere, customers who refused to pay, weather that could kill you if you were not careful, and enough mechanical problems to fill a repair manual. But what happened to me last month, on what was supposed to be a routine run from Chicago to Phoenix, was something that challenged everything I believed about the nature of reality itself. The load was nothing special, manufactured goods bound for distribution centers in the Southwest. I had made this exact run hundreds of times over the years, and I knew every mile marker, every truck stop, and every shortcut between Lake Michigan and the Sonoran Desert. It was the kind of familiar route that allows your mind to wander while your hands and feet operate the truck on autopilot, the kind of drive that veteran truckers can complete in their sleep, which is why what happened at that rest stop in New Mexico was so disturbing. I knew that stretch of highway like my own backyard, but somehow I ended up in a place that should not have existed. I had been driving for about 10 hours when I reached the point where federal regulations required me to take a mandatory rest break. My logbook showed that I had exactly 47 minutes of drive time remaining before I would be legally required to stop for at least 10 hours. But I was approaching a rest area that I had used many times before, and it made sense to stop there rather than risk running out of legal driving time in a less convenient location. The rest stop was nothing fancy, just a concrete building with restrooms and vending machines, surrounded by a parking area large enough to accommodate about 20 big rigs. I pulled into the rest stop just as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the desert landscape. There were already several other trucks parked in the lot, their drivers presumably catching up on their mandatory rest periods or grabbing snacks from the vending machines. I found a parking spot away from the other vehicles, set my brakes, and shut down my engine. According to my watch, it was exactly 6:47 p.m. Mountain Time, and I planned to spend about 20 minutes taking care of personal business, checking my logbook and stretching my legs before continuing on toward Phoenix. The restroom facility was typical of what you find at highway rest stops, clean enough to use but obviously maintained by the lowest bidder. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting an uneven illumination across white tile floors that had seen better decades. The vending machines outside were the usual collection of snack foods and soft drinks, with prices that reflected their monopoly status in the middle of nowhere. I bought a bag of chips and a bottle of water, then walked around the perimeter of the parking area to get some exercise after hours of sitting behind the wheel. As I walked, I chatted briefly with a few other drivers who were also taking their breaks. There was an older gentleman named Frank driving a Peterbilt with Wisconsin plates, a middle-aged woman named Lisa hauling refrigerated goods in a white Freightliner, and a young guy named Mike, who could not have been more than 25 and was obviously new to the trucking life. Normal people doing normal jobs, the kind of casual interactions that make rest stops social gathering places for the trucking community. Nothing unusual, nothing memorable, just the routine exchange of information about road conditions and fuel prices. When I returned to my truck, I checked my watch and was surprised to see that it was still 6:47 p.m. The digital display had not changed at all during my 20-minute break, which seemed impossible. I assumed that the battery was dying, or that I had somehow misread the time when I first parked. Electronic watches are not immune to malfunction, and after 31 years of trucking, I had learned not to rely completely on any single piece of equipment. I checked the clock on my dashboard, but it also showed 6:47 p.m., which was beginning to concern me. I walked back to the rest stop building to check the clock on the wall inside the restroom facility, thinking that would give me an accurate reading of the actual time. But that clock also showed 6:47 p.m., frozen at exactly the same moment as my watch and my dashboard display. 3 different timepieces, all showing the same time, all apparently stopped at the exact moment I had arrived at the rest stop. The coincidence seemed too unlikely to be accidental, but I could not think of any reasonable explanation for what was happening. I decided to talk to some of the other drivers to see if they had noticed anything unusual about the time displays in their trucks. Frank, the older driver with the Wisconsin plates, was sitting in his cab filling out his logbook, and he looked up when I knocked on his door. I asked him what time he had, and he checked his watch before answering that it was 6:47 p.m. When I mentioned that my timepieces seemed to be stuck at that same time, he just shrugged and said that electronic equipment sometimes acted strangely in certain locations, probably due to radio interference or solar activity. Lisa, the woman driving the refrigerated truck, gave me the same answer when I asked her about the time. 6:47 p.m., according to her watch, her dashboard clock, and her cell phone. She seemed completely unconcerned about the time issue, explaining that she was more worried about maintaining the proper temperature in her trailer than keeping track of minutes and seconds. Mike, the young driver, also reported that all his timepieces showed 6:47 p.m., but he thought it was just a coincidence that we had all arrived at the rest stop at the same moment. I walked back to my truck, increasingly disturbed by the situation, but unable to identify exactly what was wrong. Everything appeared normal. The other drivers seemed relaxed and unconcerned, going about their usual rest stop routines of checking their equipment, updating their logbooks, and preparing for the next leg of their journeys. But something felt wrong in a way that I could not articulate. Some subtle wrongness that made my skin crawl despite the warm desert evening. That was when I noticed that the sun had not moved in the sky. When I'd first arrived at the rest stop, the sun was setting toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across the parking area. But now, 20 minutes later, the sun was in exactly the same position, casting exactly the same shadows, as if time had stopped completely. The light had not changed, the shadows had not shifted, and the temperature remained exactly the same as when I had first stepped out of my truck. I began to pay closer attention to the other drivers, watching their movements and listening to their conversations. Frank was filling out his logbook with the same entries he'd been making when I first spoke to him, using the same pen strokes and making the same calculations. Lisa was checking the temperature readings on her refrigeration unit, performing exactly the same inspection routine she had completed earlier. Mike was walking around his truck, conducting the same pre-trip inspection with the same methodical attention to detail. It was as if everyone at the rest stop was stuck in a loop, repeating the same actions and conversations over and over again without realizing what was happening. When I approached Frank for a second time and asked him about the time, he gave me exactly the same response, word for word, as if our previous conversation had never occurred. Lisa and Mike responded identically when I questioned them again, showing no recognition that we had already discussed the time issue. I began to feel genuinely frightened as I realized that I might be trapped in some kind of temporal anomaly, a pocket of space and time where the normal rules of cause and effect had been suspended. Every watch, every clock, every timepiece in the rest stop was frozen at 6:47 p.m., and every person except me seemed to be unconsciously repeating the same 47-minute cycle of activities without any awareness that they were stuck in a loop. I decided to test my hypothesis by leaving the rest stop and continuing on my route to Phoenix. If I was correct about being trapped in a time loop, then driving away from the location might break the cycle and return me to normal time. I started my engine, released my brakes, and pulled out of the parking area onto the highway access road. But as I reached the point where the access road merged with the interstate, something strange happened. Instead of continuing west toward Phoenix, I found myself turning around and driving back to the rest stop as if my truck was being controlled by some external force. I tried again, this time paying closer attention to my own actions and fighting against the impulse to return to the rest stop, but the result was the same. Every time I attempted to leave, some irresistible compulsion forced me to turn around and return to the parking area, where I would find myself back in the same parking spot I had originally chosen. The other drivers were still there, still going through their same routines, still completely unaware that anything unusual was happening. As the situation continued, I began to notice other disturbing details about the rest stop. The vending machines dispensed exactly the same snacks in exactly the same sequence, no matter how many times I made purchases. The restroom facilities remained in exactly the same condition, with the same amount of soap in the dispensers and the same number of paper towels in the holders, as if they were being constantly reset to their original state. Even the trash cans contained exactly the same amount of garbage, arranged in exactly the same patterns. I tried to communicate with the other drivers about what was happening, but they seemed unable to process information that contradicted their programmed routines. When I tried to explain that we were trapped in a time loop, they would nod politely and then immediately change the subject to something within their scripted conversation patterns. When I tried to show them evidence of the repeated cycles, they would look confused for a moment and then forget what I'd just shown them. The psychological strain of being trapped in this situation began to take its toll. I was the only person at the rest stop who retained memory of previous loops, the only one who could see the repetitive patterns that governed everyone else's behavior. It was like being the only sane person in an asylum, watching other patients go through the same meaningless motions over and over again without any awareness of their condition. I started keeping detailed notes about each loop, documenting the exact sequence of events and the precise timing of each repeated action. Frank would always start filling out his logbook at 6:52 p.m. and finish at 7:09 p.m. Lisa would check her refrigeration unit at 7:03 p.m. and complete her inspection at 7:18 p.m. Mike would begin his pre-trip inspection at 7:11 p.m. and conclude at 7:26 p.m. The patterns were absolutely consistent down to the second, as if controlled by some cosmic clockwork mechanism. By the 10th loop, I was beginning to understand that this was not a natural phenomenon. The rest stop was not just stuck in time, it was actively maintaining the loop through some kind of supernatural or technological means that I could not comprehend. The question was whether I could find a way to break the cycle and escape back to normal reality, or whether I was doomed to repeat the same 47 minutes for eternity. I began to explore every inch of the rest stop, looking for clues about what might be causing the temporal distortion. In the restroom building, I found a memorial plaque that I had not noticed during my initial visit. It commemorated a truck driver named Robert Harrison, who had died at this exact location in 1987 after suffering a heart attack while taking a rest break. According to the plaque, Harrison had been found dead in his cab at exactly 6:47 p.m., still clutching his logbook and apparently trying to complete his required entries. The connection seemed too obvious to be coincidental. The time loop was centered on 6:47 p.m., the exact moment of Robert Harrison's death. Somehow, his final moments had become trapped in this location, creating a temporal anomaly that ensnared anyone who happened to stop here during their own rest breaks. But understanding the cause of the phenomenon did not immediately suggest a solution for escaping it. I decided that the key to breaking the loop might lie in completing whatever task Robert Harrison had been trying to accomplish when he died. His logbook entries had been left unfinished, his final delivery uncompleted, his truck parked but not properly secured for an extended rest period. If I could somehow complete his unfinished business, perhaps that would satisfy whatever force was maintaining the temporal prison. Using the information from the memorial plaque, I researched Robert Harrison's final delivery and discovered that he had been hauling automotive parts from Detroit to a warehouse in Phoenix. The same route I was currently traveling, the same destination I was trying to reach. It seemed that fate, or something more sinister, had deliberately brought me to this location to complete the journey that Harrison had never finished. I found Harrison's truck in the parking area, a 1985 Kenworth that looked exactly as it had on the day he died. The logbook was still open on the passenger seat, showing incomplete entries that stopped abruptly at 6:47 p.m. on October 15, 1987. I carefully studied his handwriting and the format of his record keeping, then picked up his pen and completed the entries he had been working on when his heart attack struck. As I wrote the final entry in Harrison's logbook, I felt the air around me begin to change. The oppressive weight that had been pressing down on the rest stop began to lift, and the frozen quality of the light started to shift subtly. When I looked at my watch, the display showed 6:48 p.m. for the first time since I had arrived at this cursed location. Time was moving again, and the 47-minute loop had finally been broken. The other drivers immediately began to act differently, showing awareness of their surroundings and recognition of previous conversations. Frank looked up from his logbook with surprise, remarking that he seemed to have lost track of time. Lisa checked her refrigeration unit and commented that the temperature readings looked exactly the same as they had earlier, as if no time had passed at all. Mike finished his pre-trip inspection and prepared to continue his journey, unaware that he had been repeating the same routine for hours. I returned Harrison's logbook to his truck and closed the door gently, feeling that I had helped put a restless spirit to rest after 37 years of temporal imprisonment. As I walked back to my own truck, I noticed that the memorial plaque now included a new line of text that had not been there before. Journey completed October 15th, 2024. Rest in peace. Someone or something had acknowledged that Robert Harrison's final delivery had been completed and his unfinished business resolved. I left the rest stop without speaking to the other drivers about what had happened. They would not have remembered the time loop anyway, and trying to explain the experience would only have made me sound like a crazy old trucker who had been on the road too long. But I knew what I had experienced, and I knew that I had helped solve a mystery that had been trapping innocent travelers for decades. The drive to Phoenix proceeded normally, with time flowing at its proper rate, and my clocks all showing the correct readings. I completed my delivery on schedule and filed my trip report without mentioning the supernatural detour that had added several hours to my journey. The company would not have believed the story anyway, and I was not interested in spending my final weeks as a trucker answering questions about my mental health. but the experience changed my perspective on the highways that have been my workplace for 3 decades. The roads are not just transportation corridors connecting cities and towns, but pathways through layers of time and memory where the past sometimes bleeds through into the present. Rest stops are not just places to take mandatory breaks, but gathering points for travelers whose journeys may have been interrupted by circumstances beyond their control. Somewhere out there, on highways across America, there may be other locations where time does not flow properly, where the unfinished business of deceased travelers creates temporal anomalies that trap the living alongside the dead. Truck drivers who disappear without explanation, delivery schedules that never quite add up, and mechanical problems that occur in the same locations over and over again may all be symptoms of a highway system that carries more than just commercial cargo from one destination to another. I will be retiring from trucking next month, but I will never forget the night I helped Robert Harrison complete his final delivery and escape from the temporal prison that had held him for 37 years. The highways gave me a living for 3 decades, but they also gave me a glimpse into mysteries that our rational minds cannot easily explain or our technology cannot measure. Sometimes the most important deliveries are not the ones listed on your bills of lading, but the ones that help lost souls find their way home. By 2018, I had been hauling freight across America for 12 years, and I thought I had seen everything the highways could throw at me. Drunk drivers weaving through traffic at 3 a.m, cargo that shifted and nearly flipped my rig on mountain passes, and enough road rage incidents to fill a police report book. But nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, prepared me for what happened during my run from Seattle to Miami that October. My name is Janae, and I drive a Peterbilt 379 that has been my home away from home for over a decade. She is not the prettiest truck on the road, but she is reliable. And in this business, reliability means everything. The load I picked up in Seattle seemed routine enough. Electronics shipment, sealed containers, decent pay for the mileage. The dispatcher handed me the paperwork with that usual tired smile, told me to have a safe trip, and sent me on my way. I had done this exact route dozens of times before, so I expected nothing more than long stretches of interstate, truck stop coffee, and the endless hum of diesel engines. The first 2 days went exactly as planned. I made good time through Oregon and into Idaho, stopped at my regular truck stops for fuel and mandatory rest periods, and maintained radio contact with dispatch every few hours. The weather held up, traffic was light, and my rig was running smooth as silk. I even managed to get ahead of schedule, which meant I could afford to take my time and maybe catch up on some sleep when I hit my next rest stop. Everything was normal. Everything was routine. And that should have been my first warning sign. In this business, when things go too smoothly for too long, the road usually has something unpleasant waiting around the next bend. It was somewhere in Colorado, on a long stretch of highway that cuts through absolutely nothing but prairie and scrubland, when I first noticed something was off. I had stopped for fuel at a truck stop outside of Denver and performed my usual pre-trip inspection while the tank filled. Walk around the rig, check the tires, look for any obvious problems with the trailer. That was when I noticed the mud. Fresh mud on the rear doors of the trailer, thick and still damp, despite the fact that it had not rained in this part of Colorado for weeks. The ground around the truck stop was bone dry, baked hard by the sun, so where had this mud come from? I scraped some of it off with my finger and examined it closer. It was dark, almost black, and had an odd smell to it. Not like regular dirt and water, but something else, something organic and unpleasant. I called over to the truck stop attendant, a kid who could not have been more than 20, and asked him if he had seen anyone messing around my trailer while I was inside paying for fuel. He shook his head, said he had been busy with other customers and had not noticed anything unusual. I asked him about the mud, showed him the dark substance on my finger, but he just shrugged and suggested maybe I'd picked it up somewhere along the road. His explanation made sense, I suppose, but Something about the whole situation felt wrong. The mud was too fresh, too localized to just the rear doors. If I had driven through it, there would be traces on the tires, on the undercarriage, somewhere else on the rig. But there was nothing, just those dark, wet smears on the trailer doors. I decided to let it go and climb back into my cab, but as I pulled out of the truck stop, I could not shake the feeling that I was being watched. Not by other truckers or the people at the fuel station, but by something else, something hidden. I adjusted my mirrors, scanned the area around the truck stop, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Just the usual collection of big rigs, four-wheelers, and travelers stretching their legs. Still, the feeling persisted as I merged back onto the highway and continued east. Mile after mile, that sensation of being observed stayed with me like a cold hand on the back of my neck. The next strange thing happened about 4 hours later, when I stopped for my mandatory rest period at a truck stop in Kansas. I had parked in a well-lit section of the lot, pulled my curtains closed, and settled in for some sleep. The truck stop was busy, with rigs coming and going throughout the night, their diesel engines rumbling to life and fading into the distance. Normal sounds that usually help me sleep, but around 2 in the morning, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A soft tapping sound, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from somewhere behind my cab. At first, I thought it might be another driver performing a pre-trip inspection, but the sound was too soft, too careful, like someone was trying not to be heard. I lay still in my bunk, listening to the tapping pattern. 3 short taps, pause. 3 short taps, pause. 3 short taps. It continued for several minutes, always from the same location, always with the same rhythm. I grabbed my flashlight and quietly climbed out of the cab, determined to see what was causing the noise. The truck stop was dimly lit in this section, with shadows stretching between the parked rigs like dark fingers. I walked slowly toward the back of my trailer, flashlight beams sweeping back and forth across the ground. The tapping had stopped the moment I opened my cab door, but I could feel that presence again, stronger than before, like someone was hiding just out of sight, watching my every move. I reached the rear of the trailer and examined the doors more carefully with my flashlight. The mud stains were still there, but now they looked different somehow. Fresher, wetter, as if they had been renewed while I was sleeping. And there was something else. Small scratches around the lock mechanism, as if someone had been trying to pick it or force it open. The scratches were fresh, bright metal showing through the painted surface. My heart started pounding as I realized what this meant. Someone had been trying to get into my trailer, and they might still be out here in the darkness, watching me discover their handiwork. I called out into the night, my voice carrying across the truck stop lot. Asked if anyone was there, if anyone needed help. No response, just the distant hum of highway traffic and the occasional rumble of a diesel engine starting up. But I knew I was not alone. Every instinct I had developed over 12 years of trucking was screaming that something was very wrong with this situation. I walked around the entire perimeter of my rig, checking every inch for signs of tampering or forced entry. The scratches around the trailer lock were the only visible evidence, but the feeling of being watched never left me. I climbed back into my cab and tried to get some sleep, but it was no use. Every sound from outside made me jump. Every shadow that moved past my curtained windows made my pulse race. I kept thinking about those scratches around the lock, about the fresh mud on the trailer doors, about that rhythmic tapping in the night. Someone was definitely interested in my cargo, but who and why? The electronics shipment was valuable, sure, but not valuable enough to justify this kind of elaborate stalking behavior. Unless there was something else in those sealed containers, something I had not been told about. When dawn finally broke, I performed the most thorough pre-trip inspection of my career. I checked every inch of the rig, looking for any signs that someone had tampered with my load or hidden something on my truck. Everything seemed normal, but appearances can be deceiving. I called dispatch and reported the attempted break-in, but they seemed more concerned about my delivery schedule than my safety. "Get the load to Miami on time," they said, and they would handle the security concerns from their end. Easy for them to say from behind their office desks hundreds of miles away. I pulled out of the Kansas truck stop with a heavy feeling in my stomach and a constant eye on my mirrors. If someone was following me, I was going to spot them. But the highway behind me looked normal, just the usual mix of commercial traffic and passenger vehicles. No one seemed to be maintaining a consistent distance or showing any unusual interest in my rig. Maybe the attempted break-in had been a one-time thing. An opportunistic thief who gave up when the lock proved too difficult to pick. Maybe I was letting my imagination run wild after too many hours on the road and too little sleep. That hope lasted until my next fuel stop in Oklahoma. I had pulled into a large truck plaza, the kind with multiple fuel islands and plenty of space for big rigs to maneuver. While my tank filled, I walked around to check the trailer again, and what I found made my hands shake. The rear doors were slightly ajar. Not obviously open, just a tiny gap that would be invisible unless you knew what to look for. But I always check my doors, always make sure they are completely closed and locked. It is second nature after 12 years on the road. Someone had opened my trailer doors and tried to close them again, but had not quite managed to get them perfectly aligned. My first instinct was to swing the doors wide open and see what was inside, but something held me back. What if whoever had been messing with my load was still in there? What if this was some kind of trap designed to catch me off guard when I investigated? Instead, I walked to the truck stop office and asked them to call the local police. If someone had broken into my trailer, I wanted law enforcement involved before I opened those doors. The desk clerk looked at me like I was crazy, but made the call. 20 minutes later, a county sheriff deputy arrived and listened to my story with the kind of patient expression cops use when they think you are probably wasting their time. The deputy agreed to examine the trailer with me, and together we approached the rear doors. He had his hand on his sidearm, and I had a tire iron in my grip, both of us prepared for whatever we might find inside. The deputy pulled one door open while I held my flashlight ready. The beam cut through the darkness inside the trailer, illuminating stacked pallets of electronics boxes exactly as they should be. Nothing appeared disturbed. Nothing seemed out of place. But appearances, as I was learning, could be very deceiving. The deputy climbed up into the trailer for a closer look while I held the flashlight. He moved carefully between the pallets, checking for any signs of theft or tampering. Everything looked normal until he reached the front of the trailer near the bulkhead that separates the cargo area from my cab. That was when he stopped moving and called my name in a voice that had gone very quiet and very serious. I climbed up into the trailer and joined him at the front of the load, and what I saw there made my knees go weak. Someone had built a small shelter between the front pallets and the bulkhead. Not a professional job, just some cardboard arranged to create a hidden space about the size of a large closet. Inside this makeshift shelter were a sleeping bag, some empty food containers, a plastic water jug, and several items that made my stomach turn. A collection of photographs, all taken through truck cab windows, showing female drivers sleeping in their bunks. A notebook filled with handwritten observations about truck routes, rest stop schedules, and personal details about various women truckers. And worst of all, a small bag containing what looked like locks of human hair in different colors. The deputy immediately called for backup and told me to get out of the trailer. This was now a crime scene, and we had stumbled onto something much more serious than simple cargo theft. Someone had been living in my trailer, using it as a mobile base of operations for stalking female truck drivers across multiple states. The sleeping bag was still warm, which meant whoever had been hiding in there had only recently left. Maybe when I stopped for fuel, maybe when the deputy arrived, but definitely within the last hour or two. As we waited for additional law enforcement to arrive, the deputy asked me detailed questions about my route, my schedule, and when I had first noticed signs that someone was messing with my trailer. I told him about the mud in Colorado, the tapping sounds in Kansas, and the slightly open doors here in Oklahoma. He took notes and made phone calls, coordinating with other jurisdictions along my route. Apparently, there had been reports of a suspicious person lurking around truck stops in several states, always targeting locations where female drivers were known to rest. The FBI got involved within hours, treating this as a federal case since it crossed state lines and involved interstate commerce. They impounded my truck and trailer as evidence, which meant my load would not be delivered on time and I would not be getting paid for this run. But money was the least of my concerns at that point. I kept thinking about those photographs, about how long someone had been watching me sleep, about what might have happened if they had decided to make their move while I was alone at a rest stop in the middle of nowhere. The investigation revealed that the suspect was a man named Marcus Webb, a former truck driver who had lost his commercial license after multiple arrests for harassment and stalking. He had been living as a vagrant, sneaking into trailers at truck stops and hiding in cargo loads to travel across the country while continuing his predatory behavior. The FBI had been tracking him for months, following a trail of complaints from female truckers who reported feeling watched, finding evidence of tampering with their rigs, and discovering personal items missing from their cabs. Webb was arrested 3 days later at a truck stop in Arkansas, caught red-handed attempting to break into another female driver's trailer. When they searched him, he had a key ring with dozens of trailer locks that he had somehow obtained or duplicated. He had been systematically targeting women truckers for over a year, using their own rigs to transport himself across the country while documenting their movements and personal habits. The FBI found evidence linking him to at least 15 different cases of stalking and harassment. During the investigation, I learned that Webb had been in my trailer for at least 4 days, hiding among the cargo while I drove hundreds of miles, completely unaware of his presence. He had been watching me through a small hole he had cut in the bulkhead, observing my daily routines and rest periods. The photographs in his collection showed me sleeping, eating, and even changing clothes in what I thought was the privacy of my own cab. The violation I felt was beyond description, knowing that this predator had been inches away from me for days, studying my every move. The whole experience changed how I approach my job. I now perform much more thorough inspections of my trailer before accepting any load, checking not just for mechanical issues, but for any signs that someone might have gained unauthorized access. I have upgraded my cab locks, installed additional lighting around my usual parking spots, and maintain regular radio contact with other drivers whenever possible. The open road, which once felt like freedom, now feels full of potential threats and hidden dangers. Webb was eventually convicted on multiple federal charges and sentenced to 15 years in prison. But knowing he is locked up does not completely erase the memory of those 4 days when I was unknowingly sharing my truck with a predator. Every time I check my mirrors, every time I hear an unusual sound from the trailer, every time I stop at an isolated rest area, I remember that sometimes the most dangerous cargo is not what you knowingly carry, but what hides in the shadows of your load, watching and waiting for the right moment to strike. The trucking industry talks a lot about road safety, about proper maintenance and defensive driving techniques, but they do not talk much about the human predators who see our rigs as hunting grounds, our isolation as opportunity, and our cargo areas as perfect hiding spots. That October run from Seattle to Miami taught me that sometimes the greatest danger on the highway is not mechanical failure or bad weather, but the monsters who walk on 2 legs and hide in plain sight, turning our mobile homes into mobile nightmares. My name is Indiana, and I have been a long-haul trucker for 15 years. My daughter Jalen joined me on the road 3 years ago when she turned 18, and we have been running as a father-daughter team ever since. It is not the easiest life for a young woman, but Jalen has always been tough, and she wanted to see the country before settling down to college or a regular job. We specialize in delivering to remote locations that other drivers avoid, places where the roads are bad and the customers are sometimes stranger than the cargo they order. But what happened to us in July of 2023, during a delivery to a compound in rural Texas, was beyond anything either of us had ever experienced. The load started normally enough. We picked up a mixed shipment in Phoenix, Arizona, containing what appeared to be survival supplies and construction materials, canned food, water purification tablets, medical supplies, tools, building hardware, and several dozen cases of ammunition. Nothing illegal or unusual for a remote location, just the kind of items that people living off the grid might need to maintain their independence. The paperwork was in order. The payment had been processed in advance, and the destination was clearly marked on our GPS system. What should have been a red flag was the delivery address itself. Instead of a street number or business name, we were given only GPS coordinates that pointed to a location in the West Texas desert, about 200 miles from the nearest town. The instructions were to follow a dirt road off State Highway 118 for approximately 30 miles until we reached a gate marked with a white cross. We were told to arrive during daylight hours and to call a specific phone number when we were 10 miles from the delivery point. The whole arrangement felt secretive and unusual, but we had made similar deliveries to ranches and mining operations in remote areas, so we assumed it was just another off-grid customer. The drive from Phoenix to the Texas border went smoothly, and we made good time across the desert highways. Jalen was driving, while I caught up on some sleep in the passenger seat, and she woke me up when we reached the turnoff point on Highway 118. The dirt road was unmarked and barely visible from the main highway, just a pair of tire tracks leading into the scrubland toward a line of low hills in the distance. But our GPS confirmed that this was the correct route to our delivery coordinates, so we turned off the paved highway and began the long, slow journey across the desert. The road was worse than I had expected, barely maintained and full of ruts and rocks that made our trailers sway dangerously behind us. We had to keep our speed down to avoid damaging our cargo or breaking an axle on the rough terrain, which meant the 30-mile drive took over 2 hours to complete. The landscape was desolate and hostile, with nothing but sagebrush and cactus stretching to the horizon in all directions. No buildings, no power lines, no signs of human habitation anywhere. Just endless miles of empty desert under a burning sun. As we approached the 10-mile mark from our destination, I called the number we had been given and spoke to a man with a deep voice and what sounded like a slight accent. He confirmed that we were expected and provided additional directions to the compound entrance. But something about his tone made me uncomfortable, a kind of cold formality that suggested we were not welcome guests but necessary intruders who would be tolerated only as long as required. He warned us to stay on the marked road and not to deviate from the prescribed route for any reason, as the area contained dangerous terrain and wildlife. The compound appeared ahead of us like a mirage in the desert heat, a collection of buildings surrounded by a high chain-link fence topped with razor wire. The gate we had been told to look for was clearly marked with a large white cross, just as described in our instructions. But as we got closer, I could see that this was not a typical ranch or mining operation. The buildings inside the fence were arranged in a precise geometric pattern around a central courtyard, and there were dozens of vehicles parked in orderly rows, from pickup trucks to military-style Humvees. Armed guards were visible at several positions along the fence line. We pulled up to the gate and waited while one of the guards approached our truck. He was a young man, probably in his 20s, wearing camouflage clothing and carrying what looked like an assault rifle. His manner was polite but formal, and he asked to see our delivery paperwork and identification. After examining our documents carefully, he opened the gate and directed us to follow a marked path to the unloading area in the center of the compound. I noticed that other guards were watching our truck closely as we drove through the facility. The unloading area was a concrete pad surrounded by several warehouse-type buildings, with a group of men waiting to help us with the cargo. They were all dressed similarly in camouflage or khaki clothing. All appeared to be in excellent physical condition and all carried sidearms and holsters on their belts. They worked efficiently and quietly to remove our cargo from the trailer, checking each item against a detailed manifest and organizing everything into separate categories. The whole operation had a military precision that felt out of place for civilian delivery. While the unloading was taking place, I struck up a conversation with what appeared to be the supervisor, a middle-aged man with graying hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. He introduced himself only by his first name, David, and explained that the compound was a religious retreat for people who wanted to live according to biblical principles without interference from the outside world. He seemed friendly enough, but I noticed that he was careful not to provide too many details about their organization or their specific beliefs. Jalen, meanwhile, had gotten out of the truck to stretch her legs and was looking around the compound with the curiosity of a young person encountering something completely outside her normal experience. She pointed out to me that many of the people we could see appeared to be children and teenagers, and that all of the women and girls were dressed in long skirts and head coverings. There was something about the whole scene that felt wrong to her, she said, like everyone was performing roles rather than living naturally. As the unloading continued, I began to notice other disturbing details about the compound. The residential buildings had bars on the windows, and there were no obvious recreational facilities or areas where children might play. The few women we saw appeared nervous and avoided making eye contact with us. Most significantly, I realized that despite David's explanation that this was a voluntary religious community, I had not seen anyone who appeared free to come and go as they pleased. Everyone seemed to be under constant supervision, and the guards were positioned as much to keep people in as to keep intruders out. When the unloading was finished and we were preparing to leave, David approached our truck with a clipboard and asked us to sign a document acknowledging that we had completed the delivery successfully. But when I read the document carefully, I realized it was much more than a simple delivery receipt. It was actually a confidentiality agreement that would legally prevent us from discussing what we had seen at the compound, or revealing its location to law enforcement or other authorities. The language was complex and legalistic, unlike anything I had ever been asked to sign for a routine cargo delivery. I told David that I needed to review the document more carefully before signing it, and asked if we could take it with us and return it by mail after consulting with our company's legal department. His reaction was immediate and alarming. His friendly demeanor disappeared completely, and he informed us that we could not leave the compound until we had signed the confidentiality agreement. Several guards had quietly positioned themselves around our truck while we were talking, and I realized that we had walked into a trap disguised as a routine business transaction. Jaylin and I exchanged glances, and I could see the fear in her eyes as she began to understand the situation we were in. We were miles from the nearest highway, surrounded by armed men in a location that no one else knew about, being pressured to sign a legal document that would silence us about whatever illegal activities were taking place at this compound. The cargo we had delivered was obviously intended to support some kind of paramilitary operation, and we had become unwilling witnesses to something much more serious than tax evasion or building code violations. I tried to remain calm and reasonable, explaining to David that we were just truck drivers doing our job and had no interest in causing problems for his organization. All we wanted was to complete our delivery and continue on our way to our next pickup. But he insisted that we could not leave until we had signed the confidentiality agreement and made it clear that the guards around our truck were prepared to enforce his decision. The situation had escalated from uncomfortable to genuinely dangerous in a matter of minutes. Jaylin, thinking faster than I was, suddenly announced that she needed to use the restroom and asked David where the facilities were located. He directed her toward one of the buildings, and she walked away from our truck with what appeared to be casual unconcern. But I knew my daughter well enough to recognize that she was up to something, and I tried to keep David's attention focused on me while she disappeared into the compound. I continued to argue about the confidentiality agreement, buying time for whatever plan Jaylin was executing. About 10 minutes later, One of the guards near the gate started shouting and pointing toward the perimeter fence. Smoke was rising from somewhere on the far side of the compound, and there was obvious confusion about what was happening. David and several of the guards ran toward the source of the disturbance, leaving only 2 men to watch me and our truck. In the chaos that followed, Jalen appeared at my side, having somehow circled around through the compound buildings without being detected. She had started a small fire in a pile of brush outside the fence, she explained, creating a distraction that would draw attention away from our truck and give us a chance to escape. While everyone was focused on the fire, we could slip away and try to reach the main highway before they realized what had happened. It was a risky plan, but staying at the compound was clearly not an option. We climbed into our truck, started the engine, and drove toward the gate as quickly as we could without appearing to panic. The guards at the gate were distracted by the fire and the shouting from the other side of the compound, and they waved us through without questioning our departure. We had told David that we needed to get some paperwork from our truck, so our movement toward the exit seemed natural enough to avoid immediate suspicion. But once we were through the gate and onto the dirt road, I floored the accelerator, and we began the desperate race back to the main highway, knowing that pursuit would not be far behind. The 30-mile drive back to Highway 118 was the longest 2 hours of my life. Our truck was not designed for high-speed off-road driving, and the rough terrain made it impossible to maintain the kind of pace that would quickly put distance between us and the compound. Every time I looked in my mirrors, I expected to see dust clouds indicating that we were being followed, but somehow we managed to reach the paved highway without encountering any pursuit vehicles. Once we were back on smooth asphalt, I pushed our truck to its maximum speed and did not slow down until we had covered over 100 miles. We called the FBI from a truck stop in El Paso and reported everything we had seen at the compound. The agent who took our report seemed familiar with the organization we described and informed us that they had been investigating similar groups throughout the Southwest for several months. Apparently, there were multiple compounds connected to a religious cult that was stockpiling weapons and supplies while holding members against their will under the guise of voluntary spiritual retreat. Our delivery had been part of their preparation for what they believed would be an imminent apocalyptic conflict with government forces. The FBI raided the compound 3 weeks later and found exactly what we had suspected. Over 200 people were being held in conditions that amounted to slavery, including dozens of children who had been separated from their parents and subjected to various forms of abuse. The leaders of the cult had been planning to use the compound as a base for terrorist attacks against government facilities, using the supplies we had delivered, along with weapons and explosives they had manufactured on site. The raid resulted in the arrest of 47 cult members on charges ranging from kidnapping and child abuse to conspiracy to commit terrorism. Many of the people we had seen at the compound were actually victims who had been lured to the location with promises of spiritual enlightenment and then prevented from leaving through physical intimidation and psychological manipulation. The children we had observed were being trained as soldiers in preparation for what the cult leaders called the final battle between good and evil. Jaylin and I were required to testify at the trial of the cult leaders, and the experience was traumatic for both of us. Hearing the details of what had been happening at that compound, seeing the victims who had been rescued from that place, and realizing how close we had come to becoming prisoners ourselves was almost more than we could handle. The defense attorneys tried to portray us as unreliable witnesses who had misunderstood what we saw, but the physical evidence recovered from the compound supported every detail of our testimony. The whole experience changed how we approach our work and evaluate potential customers. We now research delivery locations much more carefully before accepting loads, and we have established protocols for staying in contact with dispatchers when we are traveling to remote areas. We also carry additional safety equipment and have developed contingency plans for situations where we might need to escape from dangerous locations quickly. But perhaps the most important lesson we learned is that the American highway system, which connects every corner of our country and makes commerce possible across vast distances, can also be used by people with evil intentions to transport the materials they need for their destructive plans. Every load we carry, every delivery we make, has the potential to be part of something much larger and more significant than we realize. The responsibility that comes with that knowledge is both sobering and frightening. The compound in West Texas is empty now, its buildings demolished, and its land returned to the desert. The cult members who were not arrested have scattered to other locations, probably forming new organizations with similar goals and methods. But somewhere in America, there are undoubtedly other compounds like the one we discovered, other groups stockpiling supplies and preparing for conflicts that exist mainly in their own twisted imaginations. And somewhere, there are truck drivers like us, unknowingly delivering the cargo that makes those preparations possible. The highway may be freedom for those of us who choose to make our living on the road, but it can also be a pathway to places where freedom does not exist, where people are held against their will and prepared for violence against their fellow citizens. Every time we accept a delivery to an unfamiliar location, we risk becoming unwilling participants in schemes that threaten everything we believe about American society and values. The price of that freedom is constant vigilance and the willingness to act when we encounter evil disguised as legitimate commerce. Jalen and I still run as a team, still deliver to remote locations that other drivers avoid, but we do so now with a much deeper understanding of the risks involved and a much greater appreciation for the law enforcement officers who work to protect us from the predators who use our transportation system for their own evil purposes. The road is still our home, but we know now that home can sometimes lead us into places where we are not welcome, where our presence is a threat to people who would rather remain hidden from the civilized world.